Hello Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic actually comes to us from two commenters. John Voyerka and Erwin Mark Mata both requested a video about the Grey Company. Erwin also requested a video about the Stone of Erech, which happens to fit nicely into this topic, as you will see. So, Erwin, John, thank you so much for that topic. Let's talk about the Grey Company. If you come at the Lord of the Rings from the films, you might be asking, who the heck is the Grey Company? They play a pivotal role in the book, but they fell the way of Tom Bombadil and Glorfindel in the films. The Grey Company is composed of 30 Dunedain, Rangers of the North, along with a couple of VIPs that we'll talk about. In the book, they instigate Aragorn's journey through the paths of the dead, and they follow him the entire way, along with Gimli and Legolas. It's a formidable group. In the film, the Grey Company gets removed, so it's just Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas passing through the Dark Door. First, a little background on the Dunedain because it plays into why their inclusion is so important. Dunedain means Men of the West, i.e. Numenor. I've done some videos about the Numenorians in Middle-earth, but in short, Elendil ruled two kingdoms, Arnor in the north, Gondor in the south. His son Isildur also ruled over Arnor and Gondor. However, after he and his sons are tragically killed in the disaster of the Gladden Fields, done a video about that as well, Arnor and Gondor each have separate rulers. And they will not have a unified king again for thousands of years until Aragorn, late in the Third Age. Eventually, Arnor splits up into three pieces. It's no longer Arnor. Then the Witch King begins this sustained, devastating assault on the region. And though the Witch King is eventually driven off, the surviving Dunedain realize they don't have enough people left to reestablish the realm. So they become a nomadic people, the Rangers, wandering through the remnants of Arnor, but also keeping alive the royal line. Instead of kings, their leaders are now called chieftains. If Arnor had remained intact as a realm through the Third Age, pre-war Aragorn would have been known as the King of Arnor. But since there was no Arnor, he was the chieftain of the Dunedain. So that's the background for the Dunedain, who make up the Grey Company. We first hear their name mentioned by Gandalf, though he's no longer Gandalf the Grey at this point, which would have been a fun color gray tie-in. After Gandalf defeats the Balrog, he is flown to Lothlorien by Gwaihir the Eagle, where he stays for a time. This passage is when Gandalf then meets up with Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas for the first time as Gandalf the White. Thus it was that I came to Caras Galadhon, and found you but lately gone. I tarried there in the ageless time of that land where days bring healing, not decay. Healing I found, and I was clothed in white. Counsel I gave, and counsel took. Thence by strange roads I came, and messages I bring to some of you. To Aragorn I was bidden to say this: Where now are the Dunedain, Elisar, Elisar? Why do thy kinsfolk wander afar? Near is the hour when the lost should come forth, and the Grey Company ride from the north. But dark is the path appointed for thee. The dead watch the road that leads to the sea. Gandalf mentions the Dunedain, the Grey Company, a dark path watched by the dead, but it's too cryptic for Aragorn to decipher just now, so they stick a pin in that message, hoping it's going to become clear later. That day comes after Saruman is defeated at Isengard. Much of the Fellowship is riding with Theoden away from Isengard when the company realizes they're being pursued. This is a longer passage, but it's very relevant. Soon all were ready to depart, 24 horses, with Gimli behind Legolas and Merry in front of Aragorn. Presently they were riding swiftly through the night. They had not long passed the mounds at the fords of Isen, when a rider galloped up from the rear of their line. "My lord," he said to the king, "there are horsemen behind us. As we crossed the fords, I thought that I heard them. Now we are sure. They are overtaking us, riding hard." Theoden at once called a halt. The riders turned about and seized their spears. Aragorn dismounted and set Merry on the ground, and drawing his sword, he stood by the king's stirrup. The sinking moon was obscured by a great sailing cloud, but suddenly it rode out clear again. Then all heard the sound of hoofs, and at the same moment they saw dark shapes coming swiftly on the path from the fords. The moonlight glinted here and there on the points of spears. The number of the pursuers could not be told, but they seemed no fewer than the king's escort at the least. When they were some 50 paces off, Eomer cried in a loud voice, "Halt! Halt! Who rides in Rohan?" The pursuers brought their steeds to a sudden stand. A silence followed, and then in the moonlight a horseman could be seen dismounting and walking slowly forward. His hand showed white as he held it up, palm outward, in token of peace, but the king's men gripped their weapons. At 10 paces the man stopped. He was tall, a dark standing shadow. Then his clear voice rang out. "Rohan? Rohan, did you say? That is a glad word. We seek that land in haste from long afar." "You have found it," said Eomer. "When you crossed the fords yonder, you entered it. But it is the realm of Theoden the king. None ride here save by his leave. Who are you, and what is your haste?" "Halbarad Dunedain, Ranger of the North I am," cried the man. "We seek one Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and we heard that he was in Rohan." "And you have found him also," cried Aragorn. Giving his reins to Merry, he ran forward and embraced the newcomer. "Halbarad," he said, "of all joys, this is the least expected." "All is well," said Aragorn, turning back. "Here are some of my own kin, from the far land where I dwelt. But why they come, and how many they be, Halbarad shall tell us." "I have 30 with me," said Halbarad. "That is all of our kindred that could be gathered in haste. But the brethren, Elladan and Elrohir, have ridden with us, desiring to go to the war. We rode as swiftly as we might when your summons came." "But I did not summon you," said Aragorn, "save only in wish. My thoughts have often turned to you, and seldom more than tonight, yet I have sent no word. But come, all such matters must wait. You find us riding in haste and danger. Ride with us now, if the king will give his leave." Theoden was indeed glad of the news. "It is well," he said. "If these kinsmen be in any way like to yourself, my lord Aragorn, 30 such knights will be a strength that cannot be counted by heads." So the Grey Company tracks down Aragorn in Rohan, saying they've answered a summons that he didn't give. They're led by Halbarad, and they're joined by Elladan and Elrohir. Those are the twin sons of Elrond, who himself had a twin. And more on the twins in a second, but first let's hear more about the introduction to the Grey Company. Then the riders set out again, and Aragorn for a while rode with the Dunedain. And when they had spoken of tidings in the north and in the south, Elrohir said to him, "I bring word to you from my father. The days are short. If thou art in haste, remember the paths of the dead." "Always my days have seemed to me too short to achieve my desire," answered Aragorn. "But great indeed will be my haste ere I take that road." "That will soon be seen," said Elrohir. "But let us speak no more of these things upon the open road." And Aragorn said to Halbarad, "What is that you bear, kinsman?" For he saw that instead of a spear he bore a tall staff, as it were a standard, but it was close furled in a black cloth bound about with many thongs. "It is a gift that I bring you from the Lady of Rivendell," answered Halbarad. "She wrought it in secret, and long was the making. But she also sends word to you. The days now are short. Either our hope cometh, or all hopes end. Therefore, I send thee what I have made for thee. Farewell, Elfstone." And Aragorn said, "Now I know what you bear. Bear it still for me a while." And he turned and looked away to the north under the great stars, and then he fell silent and spoke no more while the night's journey lasted. So Elrond sends with his sons a reminder to Aragorn about the prophecy of the Paths of the Dead. I did a video about the prophecies of Malbeth the Seer, if you want to know more about that. He's an obscure but fairly consequential character, and his prophecy about the Paths of the Dead, very specific. Halbarad also bears a gift from Arwen, the Lady of Rivendell. Keep in mind, she's Elladan and Elrohir's sister. The gift is the Standard of Elendil, the white tree, 7 stars, and a crown on a black field. And note it says Aragorn looked away to the north under the great stars. He's looking at the Big Dipper. In Tolkien mythology, that constellation is called the Valasirka, and it was placed in the sky by the Valar long ago as a challenge to Melkor. I've done a video on that as well. There are 7 stars in the Valasirka, the Big Dipper, just like in the Standard of Elendil. And that's why Aragorn is looking at the sky. The stars on the Standard remind him of the legacy of the opposition to Melkor and his followers. Now we see Gimli and Legolas piece together who it was that actually summoned the Grey Company. "They are a strange company, these newcomers," said Gimli. "Stout men and lordly they are, and the riders of Rohan look almost as boys beside them, for they are grim men of face, worn like weathered rocks for the most part, even as Aragorn himself, and they are silent." "But even as Aragorn, they are courteous, if they break their silence," said Legolas. "And have you marked the brethren, Elladan and Elrohir? Less somber is their gear than the others, and they are fair and gallant as elven lords, and that is not to be wondered at in the sons of Elrond of Rivendell." "Why have they come? Have you heard?" asked Merry. "They answered a summons, as you heard," said Gimli. "Word came to Rivendell, they say. Aragorn has need of his kindred. Let the Dunedain ride to him in Rohan. But whence this message came, they are now in doubt. Gandalf sent it, I would guess." "Nay, Galadriel," said Legolas. "Did she not speak through Gandalf of the ride of the Grey Company from the north?" "Ah, yes, you have it," said Gimli. "The Lady of the Wood. She read many hearts and desires. Now why did we not wish for some of our own kinsfolk, Legolas?" Legolas stood before the gate, turned his bright eyes away north and east, and his fair face was troubled. "I do not think that any would come," he answered. "They have no need to ride to war. War already marches on their own lands." That last line from Legolas is true. The Elven and Dwarven kingdoms, Lothlorien, Mirkwood, Erebor, they all come under attack during the War of the Ring. So Galadriel likely sent a messenger to Rivendell with the summons. She's the grandmother of the twins, Elladan and Elrohir, and Arwen. So we have a family affair of sorts going on here. Galadriel and Elrond remind Aragorn of the Paths of the Dead. Arwen creates the Standard of Elendil, which Aragorn will soon use to great effect. And Elladan and Elrohir ride with Aragorn, all in service of him becoming king and marrying Arwen. Before we continue on the Paths of the Dead, a little more background on the twins. Their lives touch on Aragorn and Arwen's quite a bit. Their father is Elrond, of course. Their mother is Galadriel's daughter, Celebrian, and they're witness to a tragic event that affects them for the rest of their days. In 2509, Celebrian, wife of Elrond, was journeying to Lorien when she was waylaid in the Redhorn Pass and her escort being scattered by the sudden assault of the orcs, she was seized and carried off. She was pursued and rescued by Elladan and Elrahir, but not before she had suffered torment and had received a poisoned wound. She was brought back to Imladris, and though healed in body by Elrond, lost all delight in Middle-earth, and the next year went to the Havens and passed over sea. And later, orcs, multiplying again in the Misty Mountains, began to ravage the lands, and the Dunedain and the sons of Elrond fought with them. So Celebrian, mother to the twins and Arwen, was captured, tortured by orcs, rescued by her sons, but traumatized to the point that she left her family and headed west. This certainly gives the twins a grudge against the orcs. Arwen, daughter of Elrond, in whom it was said that the likeness of Luthien had come on earth again. Long had she been in the land of her mother's kin in Lorien beyond the mountains, and was but lately returned to Rivendell to her father's house. But her brothers, Elladan and Elrahir, were out upon errantry, for they rode often far afield with the rangers of the north, forgetting never their mother's torment in the den of the orcs. So we see the connection between the twins and the rangers, and the origin of the twins' very personal hatred for the orcs. And then there's this really interesting connection. And it happened that when Arathorn and Gilraen had been married only 1 year, Eredor was taken by hill trolls in the cold fells north of Rivendell and was slain. And Arathorn became chieftain of the Dunedain. The next year, Gilraen bore him a son, and he was called Aragorn. But Aragorn was only 2 years old when Arathorn went riding against the orcs with the sons of Elrond, and he was slain by an orc arrow that pierced his eye. And so he proved indeed short-lived for one of his race, being but 60 years old when he fell. Then Aragorn, being now the heir of Isildur, was taken with his mother to dwell in the house of Elrond. And Elrond took the place of his father, and came to love him as a son of his own. So the twins were present for the death of Aragorn's father, Arathorn, at the hands of the orcs. Elladan and Elrahir probably helped get baby Aragorn to Rivendell, where their dad became his father figure. So you can see how many threads bind these characters together. One other interesting passage regarding the twins occurs shortly after the Council of Elrond. The hobbits had been nearly 2 months in the house of Elrond, and November had gone by with the last shreds of autumn, and December was passing, when the scouts began to return. Some had gone north into the Etten Moors, and others had gone west, and with the help of Aragorn and the rangers, had searched the lands far down the Grey Flood. The sons of Elrond, Elladan and Elrahir, were the last to return. They had made a great journey, passing down the Silver Lode into a strange country. But of their errand they would not speak to any, save to Elrond. That's mysterious. We know the Silver Lode is the river that flows into Lothlorien, which I believe is what's being called the strange country in that passage. So Elladan and Elrahir were sent to visit their grandmother, Galadriel, in Lothlorien, and they returned with news from her to Elrond. I think Elrond sent them with news from the Council of Elrond, mentioning the impending journey of the Fellowship. Perhaps Galadriel looked in her mirror, gathered some foresight, such as perhaps knowledge that the Fellowship would eventually come to Lothlorien. And she sent her grandsons back with news for Elrond's ears only. Just a thought. Okay, back to the Grey Company. Presently Eomer came out from the gate, and with him was Aragorn and Halbarad, bearing the great staff close furled in black. And 2 tall men, neither young nor old, so much alike were they, the sons of Elrond, that few could tell them apart. Dark-haired, grey-eyed, and their faces elven fair, clad alike in bright mail beneath cloaks of silver grey. Behind them walked Legolas and Gimli. But Merry had eyes only for Aragorn. So startling was the change that they saw in him, as if in one night many years had fallen on his head. Grim was his face, gray-hued and weary. "By your leave, Lord, I must take new counsel for myself and my kindred. We must ride our own road, and no longer in secret. For me the time of stealth has passed. I will ride east by the swiftest way, and I will take the paths of the dead." "You will do as you will, my Lord Aragorn," said Theoden. "It is your doom, maybe, to tread strange paths that others dare not. This parting grieves me, and my strength is lessened by it. But now I must take the mountain roads and delay no longer. Farewell!" "Farewell, Lord," said Aragorn. "Ride unto the great renown. Farewell, Merry. I leave you in good hands. Legolas and Gimli will still hunt with me, I hope, but we shall not forget you." "Goodbye," said Merry. He could find no more to say. He felt very small, and he was puzzled and depressed by all these gloomy words. So the Grey Company heads for the paths of the dead to fulfill a prophecy. And finally they arrive at the Dark Door. Note in this passage how Legolas is immune to the fear that is created by the ghosts. And so they came at last deep into the glen, and there stood a sheer wall of rock, and in the wall the Dark Door gaped before them like the mouth of night. Signs and figures were carved above its wide arch, too dim to read, and fear flowed from it like a gray vapor. The company halted, and there was not a heart among them that did not quail, unless it were the heart of Legolas of the Elves, for whom the ghosts of men have no terror. "This is an evil door," said Halbarad, "and my death lies beyond it. I will dare to pass it none the less, but no horse will enter." "But we must go in, and therefore the horses must go too," said Aragorn. "For if ever we come through this darkness, many leagues lie beyond, and every hour that is lost there will bring the triumph of Sauron nearer. Follow me!" Then Aragorn led the way, and such was the strength of his will in that hour that all the Dunedain and their horses followed him. And indeed, the love that the horses of the Rangers bore for their riders was so great that they were willing to face even the terror of the door, if their masters' hearts were steady as they walked beside them. I like that the loyalty the Rangers have for Aragorn gives them the courage to pass through this dark door, and in turn, the loyalty that the Rangers' horses have for them gives the horses the courage to move forward. It's a chain of trust. Note also that Halbarad mentions, "Through this door lies my death, but I'm going to take it nonetheless." That comes into play later. The company successfully passes through the paths of the dead and into the Blackroot Vale beyond. There they approach the hill of Erech, and on that hill is the aptly named Stone of Erech. It's this huge, smooth, black sphere. It was brought from Numenor in the Second Age by Isildur as a symbol of his lineage. So it's a rock from Numenor. The locals swore an oath to Isildur on that stone. During the War of the Last Alliance, the men of Dunharrow broke that oath, and so were cursed to this half-life. Hence, Aragorn is now returning to the Stone of Erech to have the oath renewed. To that stone the company came and halted in the dead of night. Then Elrohir gave to Aragorn a silver horn, and he blew upon it, and it seemed to those that stood near that they heard a sound of answering horns, as if it was an echo in deep caves far away. No other sound they heard, and yet they were aware of a great host gathered all about the hill on which they stood, and a chill wind like the breath of ghosts came down from the mountains. But Aragorn dismounted, and standing by the stone, he cried in a great voice, "Oath-breakers, why have ye come?" And a voice was heard out of the night that answered him as if from far away, "To fulfill our oath and have peace." Then Aragorn said, "The hour is come at last. Now I go to Pelargir upon Anduin, and ye shall come after me. And when all this land is clean of the servants of Sauron, I will hold the oath fulfilled. And ye shall have peace and depart forever. For I am Elisar, Isildur's heir of Gondor." And with that he bade Halbarad unfurl the great standard which he had brought, and behold, it was black, and if there was any device upon it, it was hidden in the darkness. Then there was silence, and not a whisper nor a sigh was heard again all the long night. The company camped beside the stone, but they slept little, because of the dread of the shadows that hedged them round. But when the dawn came, cold and pale, Aragorn rose at once, and led the company forth upon the journey of greatest haste and weariness that any among them had known, save he alone. And only his will held them to go on. No other mortal men could have endured it, none but the Dunedain of the north, and with them Gimli the dwarf and Legolas of the elves. That last line really shows how special this group is. No other mortal men could have endured it. It says a lot for the power of the Grey Company. It's so creepy, too, the idea of them spending the night sleeping here amongst the dead. Takes some fortitude. They're now leading the dead to the harbors of Pelargir. And we're told what happens next after the fact. Legolas and Gimli are catching Pippin and Merry up on recent events. Pippin and Merry were so eager for news that at last Legolas said, "I will tell you enough for your peace, for I felt not the horror, and I feared not the shadows of men, powerless and frail as I deemed them. 4 days and nights, and on into a fifth we rode from the black stone," he said. "And lo, in the darkness of Mordor, my hope rose, for in that gloom the shadow host seemed to grow stronger and more terrible to look upon. Silent they were, but there was a gleam in their eyes. In the uplands of Lamadan they overtook our horses and swept round us, and would have passed us by if Aragorn had not forbidden them. At his command they fell back. Even the shades of men are obedient to his will, I thought. They may serve his needs yet. On the 3rd day we came to Linhir, and there men of Lamadan contested the fords with fell folk of Umbar and Harad, who had sailed up the river. But defenders and foes alike gave up the battle and fled when we came, crying out that the king of the dead was upon them. Only Angbor, lord of Lamadan, had the heart to abide us, and Aragorn bade him gather his folk and come behind, if they dared, when the grey host had passed. At Pelargir the heir of Isildur will have need of you, he said. So we see the dead listening to Aragorn. Legolas is impressed by that. And as they pass through Linhir, there's a battle already in progress. At the sight of the dead, everyone from both sides flees for their lives, except one guy, Angbor, Lord of Lamadan. As we'll learn in a second, Aragorn names him Angbor the Fearless, great name, and tells him to gather an army and head for Pelargir. Now, he's got a small but significant part to play a little bit later, which I'll get to. Just remember Angbor the Fearless. Now Gimli continues the story of what happened when the Grey Company reached Pelargir. There at Pelargir lay the main fleet of Umbar, 50 great ships and smaller vessels beyond count. Many of those that we pursued had reached the havens before us and brought their fear with them. But the Haradrim, being now driven to the brink, turned at bay, and they were fierce in despair, and they laughed when they looked on us, for they were a great army still. But Aragorn halted and cried with a great voice, "Now come, by the black stone I call you." And suddenly the shadow host that had hung back at the last came up like a grey tide, sweeping all away before it. Faint cries I heard, and dim horns blowing, and a murmur as of countless far voices. It was like the echo of some forgotten battle in the dark years long ago. Pale swords were drawn, but I know not whether their blades would still bite, for the dead needed no longer any weapon but fear. none could withstand them. To every ship they came, and all the mariners were filled with a madness of terror and leaped overboard, save the slaves chained to the oars. Reckless we rowed among our fleeing foes, driving them like leaves until we came to the shore. And then to each of the great ships that remained, Aragorn sent one of the Dunedain, and they comforted the captives that were aboard and bade them put aside fear and be free. Aragorn spoke in a loud voice to the dead men, crying, "Hear now the words of the heir of Isildur. Your oath is fulfilled. Go back, and trouble not the valleys ever again. Depart, and be at rest." And thereupon the king of the dead stood out before the host, and broke his spear and cast it down. Then he bowed low and turned away, and swiftly the whole grey host drew off and vanished like a mist that is driven back by a sudden wind, and it seemed to me that I awoke from a dream. So the oath has been fulfilled out there in Pelargir, and the Dunedain have each been assigned to a boat to lead it back to Minas Tirith. So now we jump to the middle of the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and the ships arrive. But to the good guys, there's still some question as to who's on these ships. But then Éomer sees the standard of Elendil that Arwen made, and he knows who's on those ships. South strode Éomer, and men fled before his face, and they were caught between the hammer and the anvil. For now men leaped from the ships, and swept north like a storm. There came Legolas, and Gimli wielding his axe, and Halbarad with the standard, and Elladan and Elrohir with stars on their brow, and the dour-handed Dunedain, rangers of the north, leading a great valor of the folk of Lebenin and Lamadon, and the fiefs of the south. And before all went Aragorn with the flame of the west, Anduril like a new fire rekindled, Narsil reforged as deadly as of old, and upon his brow was the star of Elendil. So there's this awesome heroic entrance. The Grey Company leads an army, the fighting fierce. They win the day, but not without casualties. Aragorn and Éomer and Imrahil rode back towards the gate of the city, and they were now weary beyond joy or sorrow. These three were unscathed, for such was their fortune and the skill and might of their arms, and few indeed had dared to abide them or look on their faces in the hour of their wrath. But many others were hurt or maimed or dead upon the field. Neither Hirluin the fair would return to Pinnith Gelen, nor Grimbold to Grimslade, nor Halbarad to the Northlands, dour-handed ranger. No few had fallen, renowned or nameless, captain or soldier, for it was a great battle, and the full count of it no tale has told. So sadly, as he predicted, Halbarad is slain in battle. The twins, Elladan and Elrohir, survive. And this is where Angbor the Fearless comes back into play, because Aragorn is now pushing to march on the Black Gate. But the main argument against that plan is that sending the entire army would leave Minas Tirith unguarded. Well, guess whose army is on the way? "We have not only to reckon with those who fought on this field," said Aragorn. "New strength is on the way from the southern fiefs, now that the coasts have been rid. 4,000 I sent marching from Pelargir 2 days ago, and Angbor the Fearless rides before them. If we set out in 2 days more, they will draw nigh ere we depart. I judge that we could lead out 7,000 of horse and foot, and yet leave the city in better defense than it was when the assault began." So because of Angbor's incredible courage in the face of the army of the dead, he was able to follow Aragorn's leadership, command an army to go to Minas Tirith, and guard the city, giving Aragorn the freedom to ride on to the Black Gate. So, well done, Angbor the Fearless. And that's the tale of the Grey Company. I can understand why Peter Jackson cut them out of the films, but I do think he lost an important story element. In the Return of the King movie, the army of the dead sweeps in, kills all the bad guys at the Battle of Pelennor fields and leaves. In the book, the army of the dead was released by Aragorn back at Pelargir. So it's the Grey Company leading a living army that ultimately turns the tide of the battle. And remember how I said that Elendil and Isildur were kings of both Arnor and Gondor. Here we have Aragorn, chieftain of the Dunedain, leading the Grey Company, the remnant of the people of Arnor, to aid Gondor in its time of greatest need. And that act is uniting the people of Gondor and Arnor once again. And thus it makes sense when Aragorn becomes king of a reunited kingdom. And so I think that's the legacy of the heroism of the Grey Company. So thank you so much, John and Arwen, for recommending that topic. Had a great time researching this one. If you've got a topic you'd like me to talk about, feel free to put it in the comments below. Be happy to do a video about a topic of your choosing. I think next up, Theron and I are going to be talking about the Desolation of Smaug film. But thanks so much, everybody. Have a great one. Bye.